The wind howled through the towering trees of the Kentucky wilderness, whispering secrets of the past to those who dared listen. A small log cabin stood against the backdrop of the endless forest, its wooden walls sturdy but weathered by the seasons. Inside, by the dim glow of an oil lamp, a young boy sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, a worn-out book resting in his lap. His sharp eyes followed the words with hunger, an insatiable thirst for knowledge that no hardship could quench. That boy was Abraham Lincoln, born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, now LaRue County, Kentucky. Abraham's early life was anything but easy. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working farmer and carpenter, while his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a kind and nurturing woman who believed in the power of learning. But in the rugged frontier of early America, education was a luxury that many could not afford. Still, young Abraham was determined. Whenever he could, he borrowed books from neighbors, reading them by the flickering light of the fireplace. He had little formal schooling, less than a year in total, but he absorbed knowledge like a sponge. Despite his dreams, life was harsh. The Lincoln family lived off the land, growing their own food and struggling against the unforgiving elements. Hunger, sickness, and danger were constant companions. In the wilderness, survival meant labor, and from an early age, Abraham worked alongside his father, chopping wood, planting crops, and building fences. Yet, even as he worked, his mind soared beyond the fields. He dreamed of a world beyond the thick forests, of a land where knowledge could shape the future. A tragic loss. At the age of 9, Abraham faced a tragedy that would leave a permanent scar on his heart. His mother, Nancy, fell ill with milk sickness, a deadly disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had consumed poisonous plants. In the flickering light of their humble cabin, Abraham watched helplessly as his mother grew weaker by the day. Then, one evening, she called him to her bedside. "Be a good boy, Abraham," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "Love your father, love your sister, and never stop learning." With those final words, she closed her eyes forever. For days, Abraham sat by her grave, his young heart burdened with grief. But from that moment on, he made a silent promise. He would honor her memory, he would make something of himself, and he would never give up on his dreams. A new light in their lives. Time moved forward, as it always does. Thomas Lincoln remarried, bringing a woman into their lives who would change young Abraham's fate. Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, Abraham's stepmother, was a warm, encouraging woman who immediately saw the potential in him. Unlike many others, she did not scold him for reading too much or tell him that books were useless in a farmer's life. Instead, she supported him, providing him with the little education she could and ensuring that he always had time for his beloved books. With her encouragement, Abraham devoured every book he could find. He read the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, and the works of Shakespeare. Each page, each word, built within him a vision far greater than the small cabin he called home. A world beyond the farm. By the time he was a teenager, Abraham had grown into a tall, strong young man, standing at an impressive height even in his youth. His strength was legendary among the locals, but his mind was sharper than any axe he swung. Yet, despite his brilliance, he was still a boy of the wilderness. He had never seen the grand cities, never walked among men of power. He knew only the raw, untamed beauty of the frontier, and in his heart he yearned for more. One evening, as he sat outside, gazing at the endless sky, he whispered to himself, "Someday, I will leave this place. Someday, I will make a difference." Little did he know, his journey had only just begun. The sun rose over the Indiana wilderness, casting golden light on the freshly plowed fields. By now, Abraham Lincoln had grown into a strong and capable young man. Life on the frontier had hardened him, both in body and spirit, but it had not dulled his mind. If anything, his thirst for knowledge had only deepened. At 19, He was already known for his towering height and incredible strength. His hands, roughened by years of chopping wood and plowing fields, were capable of great labor. But it was his words, his ability to speak with clarity and wisdom beyond his years, that set him apart. And soon, the world would begin to notice. A taste of the world beyond. In 1828, an opportunity arose that would change young Abraham's life forever. A wealthy local man hired him and another young worker to take a flatboat full of goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. It was an incredible chance, one that would take him far from the quiet fields of Indiana and into a world bustling with life, trade, and culture. The journey was long and difficult, but Abraham embraced every challenge. He navigated the mighty river, bartered with traders, and watched as the world around him unfolded like the pages of a book. But it was not the grand buildings or the busy streets of New Orleans that would leave the greatest impact on him. It was something far darker. One afternoon, as he walked through the city's crowded streets, he came upon a sight that would haunt him for years: a slave auction. Men, women, and even children stood on a platform, their hands bound, their eyes filled with sorrow. One by one, they were sold to the highest bidder. Some were forced apart from their families, never to see them again. The cries of mothers and children filled the air, but no one around him seemed to care. Abraham clenched his fists. His heart burned with anger and sorrow. How could this be allowed? How could men just like him be treated as property? Years later, he would recall that moment, telling a friend, "If I ever get a chance to hit that thing, I'll hit it hard." He did not know it yet, but that moment in New Orleans had planted the first seed of the great purpose that would one day define his life. The power of words. Returning home, Abraham felt different. The world had opened before him, revealing both its wonders and its horrors. But he was still just a farm boy, still bound to a life of labor. Yet, something had changed. He began telling stories to those around him, recounting his adventures and the things he had seen. His way with words fascinated his neighbors, who would gather around just to listen. His humor, his wit, and his ability to bring events to life made him popular among the locals. One day, at a small gathering, he was asked to speak publicly. A simple talk, nothing grand. But when he stood to address the crowd, something stirred inside him. He spoke with confidence, with passion, and for the first time, he realized the true power of words. A move to Illinois. In 1830, the Lincoln family decided to move once again, this time to Illinois. The journey was long and exhausting, but for Abraham, it was another chance to see more of the world. By now, he was nearly 21, and something inside him knew that he could not remain a farmhand forever. He loved his family, but his mind yearned for something greater. Then, an opportunity arose. A storekeeper in New Salem, Illinois, was looking for help, and Abraham was offered a job. It was a simple position, measuring grain, selling goods, but it allowed him to meet new people, to listen to their stories, and most importantly, to continue learning. It was in New Salem that people began to notice his remarkable mind. He was a man of honesty and integrity, earning the nickname Honest Abe. But beyond that, his ability to speak, to reason, and to lead discussions impressed many. One day, a respected town elder said, "Lincoln, you should think about politics." The words echoed in his mind. Politics? Could he? He had no formal education, no wealth, no family connections. But he had something else: determination, wisdom, and an unshakable sense of justice. A challenge of strength. But before he could be taken seriously, he had to prove himself in a different way. At the time, New Salem was home to a rough and rowdy gang known as the Clary's Grove Boys, a group of strong young men who prided themselves on testing newcomers. They challenged men to fights, wrestling matches, and contests of strength. One evening, they turned their attention to Lincoln. "Let's see if the tall boy from the woods can hold his own," one of them sneered. Their leader, Jack Armstrong, stepped forward, a man known for his toughness, A wrestling match was proposed, and Abraham accepted the challenge. The crowd gathered, eager to see the fight. Armstrong lunged first, but Lincoln stood his ground, using his towering height and incredible strength to counter the attacks. They wrestled fiercely, neither giving in. Then, with one swift move, Lincoln lifted Armstrong off his feet and threw him to the ground. The crowd gasped. The Clary's Grove boys had never seen anything like it. Instead of holding a grudge, Armstrong laughed and extended a hand. From that day forward, Lincoln had earned the respect of the toughest men in town. More importantly, he had earned their trust. A future begins. With his name now known in New Salem, Lincoln decided to take the biggest step of his life. He would run for the Illinois state legislature. His campaign was simple. He spoke of honesty, hard work, and the power of education. He told stories, connected with people, and shared his vision for a better future. Though he lost his first election, something incredible happened. People remembered him. They spoke of the Indiana wilderness had taught Abraham Lincoln many things: the value of hard work, the pain of loss, and the power of knowledge. But as he grew older, the small world of farms and log cabins could no longer contain his ambitions. By his early 20s, Abraham had outgrown the fields where he once toiled. He had spent his youth swinging an axe, but his mind was sharper than any blade. He knew that his destiny lay beyond manual labor. And so, one day, he made a decision that would change his life forever: a new beginning in New Salem. In 1831, at the age of 22, Abraham left home and set out for New Salem, Illinois, a small but lively town on the banks of the Sangamon River. It was a place full of merchants, politicians, and thinkers, a place where a young man could reinvent himself. At first, he worked as a store clerk, stacking shelves, selling goods, and entertaining customers with his sharp wit and endless stories. People were drawn to him, not just because of his towering height and rugged appearance, but because of his charm, honesty, and intelligence. It wasn't long before the people of New Salem began to take notice. One day, a well-known wrestler and troublemaker named Jack Armstrong challenged Abraham to a fight. Jack was the leader of the local gang, and no one dared stand up to him. Abraham, knowing that backing down would earn him ridicule, accepted the challenge. The two men clashed in the center of town, with a crowd cheering around them. At first, Jack tried to use his brute strength, but Abraham's long arms and clever tactics helped him hold his own. When it became clear that neither man could win easily, Jack conceded, laughing, and declared Abraham the strongest man he had ever faced. From that day on, Abraham was respected in New Salem, not just for his strength, but for his fairness, courage, and refusal to back down from a challenge. The call to lead. Abraham continued working in New Salem, taking on various jobs. He split rails, ran a store, served as a postmaster, and even became a surveyor. But deep down, he knew his true calling lay elsewhere. He had always been fascinated by law and politics, spending his nights reading books on government and philosophy by candlelight. He admired George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and he dreamed of making a difference. Then, in 1832, an opportunity arose. The Black Hawk War broke out between the U.S. government and Native American tribes led by Chief Black Hawk. The Illinois militia was recruiting volunteers, and despite having no military experience, Abraham enlisted. To his surprise, the men of New Salem elected him as their captain, recognizing his natural leadership and strong sense of justice. Though he never saw combat, he learned valuable lessons about responsibility, teamwork, and decision-making. After returning from the war, his ambitions only grew stronger. That same year, he decided to take his biggest risk yet, running for the Illinois state legislature. The first political defeat. Abraham's campaign was simple but powerful. He walked for miles, knocking on doors, giving speeches, and connecting with voters. He spoke about expanding education, improving infrastructure, and making government fair for all. People loved his honesty and humor, but there was one major problem. He was young, unknown, and had no real political experience. When the election results came in, he lost. It was a crushing blow. But instead of giving up, Abraham saw it as a lesson. If he wanted to lead, he needed to learn more. So, he made another life-changing decision. He would become a lawyer. From woodsman to lawyer. Without money for law school, Abraham did the only thing he knew how to do. He taught himself. He borrowed law books from a local attorney, reading them over and over again. For hours, he sat in a small room, absorbing every word. He studied cases, memorized legal principles, and practiced speaking in front of a mirror. By 1834, his hard work paid off. He ran for office again, and this time, he won a seat in the Illinois state legislature. His journey from a poor farm boy to an elected official had been anything but easy. But Abraham Lincoln was not a man who gave up. His true journey had just begun. Abraham Lincoln had taken his first steps into the world of politics, but he was still far from the man history would remember. He had no wealth, no famous name, and no formal education. What he had was determination, an insatiable thirst for knowledge, and an unwavering sense of justice. His election to the Illinois state legislature in 1834 was only the beginning. Now, he had to prove himself, learning the art of law and politics. Even as he served in the legislature, Lincoln knew that his true power would come from mastering the law. He had no law degree, no prestigious background, and no mentors to guide him, so he did what he had always done. He taught himself. He read Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, one of the most respected law books of the time. He read legal cases, memorized court procedures, and observed seasoned lawyers argue in court. He studied late into the night, his only light coming from a flickering candle. His efforts paid off. In 1836, after passing the bar exam, Abraham Lincoln officially became a lawyer. He moved to Springfield, Illinois, where he joined the law firm of John T. Stewart, a respected attorney and politician who had recognized Lincoln's potential. It was here that he began building a reputation, not just as a lawyer, but as a man of integrity, honesty, and fairness. People began calling him Honest Abe, a man of the people. Lincoln was unlike other lawyers. He didn't dress in fancy clothes or use complicated legal jargon. Instead, he spoke in simple, clear language that ordinary people could understand. He took on cases big and small, land disputes, business contracts, criminal defense. He fought for justice, even when it meant standing against powerful interests. One case in particular demonstrated his courage. A poor widow was about to lose her farm because of an unfair land deal. Her opponents were wealthy and had hired the best lawyers in Springfield. No one believed she could win, but Lincoln took her case. He worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and crafting a compelling argument. In court, his words were powerful, his reasoning sharp. He painted a picture of fairness, arguing that the law should protect the weak as well as the strong. And in the end, he won. Word spread. People trusted him, not just as a lawyer, but as a man who stood for what was right. A love that almost wasn't. As Lincoln's career flourished, so did his personal life. In 1839, at a social gathering in Springfield, he met a bright, educated woman named Mary Todd. Mary was from a wealthy family, well-read, and deeply interested in politics. Unlike many women of her time, she was strong-willed, opinionated, and unafraid to challenge Lincoln in conversation. She saw something in him, something great. But their relationship was not easy. Lincoln was uncertain, hesitant about marriage. He doubted whether he could provide for a wife, whether he was worthy of love. At one point, he even broke off their engagement, plunging into deep sadness. Yet, fate had other plans. In 1842, after years of confusion and soul-searching, Lincoln and Mary Todd reunited and married. Their love was full of ups and downs, but one thing was certain. Mary believed in Lincoln's destiny, even when he doubted himself. A voice for the nation. By the 1840s, Lincoln had become a rising political figure in Illinois. He had served multiple terms in the state legislature and was now setting his sights higher. In 1846, he ran for Congress and won. He became a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, where he quickly made a name for himself. He was outspoken against corruption, fought against the expansion of slavery, and pushed for economic policies that would help ordinary Americans. But not everyone liked his views. His opposition to the Mexican-American War was unpopular, and many saw him as weak. In 1848, after only one term, he lost his re-election bid. It was a humiliating defeat. For the first time in years, Lincoln felt lost. Had he reached too high? Had he made a mistake? Disappointed, he returned to Springfield, believing that his political career might be over. The wilderness years. For the next few years, Lincoln focused on his law practice. He built a successful career, traveling across Illinois, handling cases in small-town courthouses, and winning the respect of juries. But he couldn't ignore what was happening in the country. Slavery was spreading. The nation was becoming divided. New laws, like the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, allowed slavery to expand into new territories. Lincoln could not stay silent. In 1854, he gave one of his most powerful speeches yet, condemning the spread of slavery. His words electrified audiences. People began to see him not just as a lawyer, but as a leader once again. And then in 1858 came the moment that would thrust him back into the national spotlight, his legendary debates with Stephen Douglas. The world was about to see that Abraham Lincoln's story was far from over. By the late 1850s, Abraham Lincoln's political career was rekindled. After years away from public office, he found himself pulled back into the national conversation. Slavery was tearing the country apart, and Lincoln knew he could no longer remain silent. In 1858, he set his sights on the U.S. Senate, challenging the powerful incumbent Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas was one of the most influential politicians in the country, known for his fiery speeches and strong support of popular sovereignty, the idea that individual states should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Lincoln, on the other hand, firmly believed that slavery was morally wrong and should not be allowed to spread any further. And so, in the summer of 1858, Lincoln and Douglas embarked on a series of debates that would shape the future of America. A house divided. Before the debates even began, Lincoln delivered one of his most famous speeches in Springfield, Illinois. Standing before a crowd of supporters, he spoke words that would echo through history. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. These words were bold, almost prophetic. Lincoln was not calling for war, but he was warning the nation that a great crisis was coming. The country could not survive in its current state. Many called his speech too extreme. Even some of his supporters worried that it would cost him the election. But Lincoln believed in speaking the truth, no matter the cost. With that, the Lincoln-Douglas debates began. The battle of words. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were unlike anything the country had ever seen. Over the course of 3 months, the two men faced off 7 times in front of massive crowds, sometimes numbering in the thousands. Each debate lasted 3 hours. One candidate would speak for an hour, the other for an hour and a half, and then the first candidate would have 30 minutes to respond. The topics were clear. Should slavery expand into new territories? Does the Declaration of Independence apply to all men, including Black Americans? What was the future of America? Lincoln, though not as polished as Douglas, was a master of logic and moral argument. He spoke with passion and conviction, making it clear that he was not an abolitionist who wanted to end slavery overnight, but he firmly believed that slavery should not spread any further. Douglas, on the other hand, was a seasoned politician. He argued that states should decide their own fate and accused Lincoln of wanting racial equality, a controversial stance at the time. At one of the most famous debates in Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln trapped Douglas with a difficult question. Can the people of a U.S. territory lawfully exclude slavery before it becomes a state? Douglas was in trouble. If he answered yes, he would anger the South. If he answered no, he would lose support in the North. He chose to say yes, a response that became known as the Freeport Doctrine. This answer helped Douglas win the Senate race, but it cost him dearly. It split the Democratic Party and weakened his future chances of becoming president. Defeat that paved the way. Despite his brilliant performance in the debates, Lincoln lost the Senate election. It was a painful defeat. He had fought with everything he had, but Douglas was too powerful. Most men would have walked away. Most would have accepted defeat and faded into history. But Lincoln was not most men. Though he had lost the Senate race, the debates had made him famous across the country. Newspapers printed his speeches. People began quoting him. And suddenly, Abraham Lincoln was no longer just a local politician. He was a national figure. He knew something else, too. His fight was far from over. The debates had set the stage for a much greater battle. A battle for the presidency. And in 1860, that battle would begin. By 1859, Abraham Lincoln was no longer just a lawyer from Illinois. The debates with Stephen Douglas had made him a national figure, and his clear moral stance against the expansion of slavery had gained him admirers across the country. But despite his growing reputation, few believed he could actually become president. America was in turmoil. The North and South were growing further apart. The issue of slavery was tearing the country in two, and the 1860 presidential election would decide the future of the nation. Lincoln had lost to Douglas in the Senate race, but his greatest challenge was yet to come: a nation in crisis. By 1860, America was on the verge of collapse. The division between free and slave states had deepened. The Fugitive Slave Act and the Dred Scott decision had outraged many Northerners, while Southerners felt that their way of life was under attack. A new political force, the Republican Party, was rising. It was formed by those who opposed the spread of slavery, and many believed that only a strong leader could hold the country together. Lincoln was not the most famous Republican. Many party leaders preferred Senator William Seward of New York, a brilliant politician with years of experience. But Seward was also seen as too radical. His open hostility toward the South worried many moderates. Lincoln, on the other hand, was a self-made man, a powerful speaker, and, most importantly, someone who could unite different factions of the Republican Party. In May 1860, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln's supporters worked behind the scenes to win him the nomination. On the third ballot, it happened. Abraham Lincoln was chosen as the Republican candidate for president. The log cabin lawyer from the frontier had risen to the highest level of politics. The election of 1860. Lincoln's opponents were divided. The Democratic Party split in two. Northern Democrats supported Stephen Douglas, while Southern Democrats chose John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. A fourth candidate, John Bell, represented the Constitutional Union Party, which tried to ignore the slavery issue altogether. With his rivals fighting among themselves, Lincoln gained a major advantage. His campaign focused on a simple but powerful message: slavery should not expand. The Union must remain strong. America must move forward together. Lincoln did not campaign in the South, where he was deeply unpopular. Instead, his supporters spread his speeches and ideas through newspapers and pamphlets. As Election Day approached, tensions rose. Southern leaders warned that if Lincoln won, they would leave the Union. Then, on November 6, 1860, the results came in. Abraham Lincoln had won. He became the 16th President of the United States, defeating Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell. But there was a problem. He had won without a single Southern state. In the South, his victory was seen as an act of war. The Union begins to break. Before Lincoln could even take office, the South reacted. On December 20th, 1860, just weeks after the election, South Carolina seceded from the United States. One by one, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By February 1861, They had formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln had not even set foot in the White House, yet the nation he was about to lead was already falling apart. Would he be able to hold it together? The journey to Washington. Lincoln's journey to the presidency was not just political. It was also personal. As he prepared to leave Springfield, Illinois, he gave an emotional farewell speech to his neighbors and friends. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young man to an old man. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return. As he boarded the train to Washington, he knew his life would never be the same, but his journey was dangerous. Rumors spread that assassins were waiting for him in Baltimore. His advisors convinced him to travel in disguise, and on February 23, 1861, under the cover of darkness, Lincoln arrived in Washington, D.C. He had escaped the first threat, but many more were coming. President Lincoln. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood before a divided nation and took the oath of office. In his inaugural address, he made a plea for unity. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. But the South was not listening. 1 month later, on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun, and Abraham Lincoln's greatest challenge was just beginning. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., the first cannon shot echoed across Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. Abraham Lincoln, barely a month into his presidency, now faced the greatest crisis in American history. The Union was falling apart, and the fate of the nation rested on his shoulders. Could he save it? The war begins. When Lincoln took office, 7 Southern states had already seceded. But after the attack on Fort Sumter, Vermont, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee joined the Confederacy. The United States was now split into 2 nations: the Union Northern states, led by Lincoln; the Confederacy Southern states, led by Jefferson Davis. Lincoln had no choice but to fight. On April 15, 1861, he called for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to put down the rebellion. Thousands answered, but the war would not be over quickly. The South was determined to fight for its way of life, and Lincoln knew that saving the Union would take everything he had. The struggles of leadership. The war was not just fought on battlefields. It was fought in Lincoln's mind. He had to lead a country at war while keeping the government running. He had to deal with generals who were slow, hesitant, and afraid to fight. He had to keep the border states, like Kentucky and Missouri, from joining the Confederacy. He had to manage political enemies who doubted him at every step. For months, the Union Army struggled. Defeats at Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville made Lincoln frustrated and exhausted. He barely slept. He barely ate. But he refused to give up. He kept learning, kept strategizing, and kept searching for the right leaders. The Emancipation Proclamation. By 1862, Lincoln realized something. The war was not just about saving the Union. It was about ending slavery. Slavery had caused the war, and as long as it existed, the country would never be truly united. So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. All persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion against the United States shall be forever free. This did not immediately free all enslaved people, but it changed the war forever. Now, the Union was not just fighting for unity. It was fighting for freedom. Thousands of formerly enslaved men joined the Union Army, ready to fight for their own liberty. Lincoln's bold decision gave the North new energy while weakening the South. Turning the tide, the war dragged on. Thousands of lives were lost. Then came Gettysburg. From July 1st to 3rd, 1863, Union and Confederate forces clashed in the bloodiest battle of the war. Over 50,000 men were killed or wounded. But when the smoke cleared, the Union had won a decisive victory. Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg months later and delivered one of the most famous speeches in history. "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." His words reminded the country why they were fighting: for freedom, for justice, for a future where all men were truly equal. The final push. By 1864, Lincoln had finally found the right general, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was ruthless, aggressive, and willing to do whatever it took to win. He launched a total war strategy, destroying Confederate railroads, supply lines, and cities. Meanwhile, General William T. Sherman led his famous March to the Sea, devastating the South's ability to fight. The Confederacy was falling apart. On April 9, 1865, after 4 years of bloodshed, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union was saved. Victory and tragedy. Lincoln had done it. He had preserved the nation, but his time was running out. On April 14, 1865, just days after the war ended, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, slipped into Lincoln's private box and shot him in the head. Lincoln was rushed to a nearby house, but the wound was fatal. On April 15, 1865, at 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln passed away. The nation wept. Legacy of a leader. Lincoln was gone, but his impact would never fade. He had saved the Union. He had ended slavery. He had proven that democracy could survive even its darkest moments. Today, Lincoln is remembered not just as a president, but as a symbol of courage, wisdom, and justice. His words still inspire. His leadership still teaches. His legacy lives on. The boy who read by candlelight. The man who spoke with honesty. The leader who saved a nation. Abraham Lincoln will never be forgotten.